Oh, hey, good morning. So, glad to be back. And this week we are kind of wrapping up. And I want to suggest there's a way of framing all the issues we've been doing in this class that has been striking me as a kind of revelation through this term. And I really want to try this on you in this last week. But I have to say I've never tried it on anyone else before as a general way of framing the questions here. So it strikes me as a revelation, and I hope it will strike you as a revelation too, but let's see how it goes. This is to put a lot of the questions we've been thinking about in terms of a general contrast between imaginative understanding and objective explanation. This is a contrast that comes up in lots and lots of different areas, and I'll begin by just setting out how often it's come up in different areas, and then glance at how this works how this might apply to Frege's discussion of sense and to Russell's discussion of acquaintance. Yeah, and then on Wednesday, I might go, depending on how you feel, what you make of it, we might go on and look at how this bears on naturalism and Fodor and Dretschke and Wittgenstein on following a rule. Let me try this. So the idea is that there's a general contrast between having an imaginative understanding of a phenomenon on the one hand and having an objective explanation of it. And in the tradition, imagination is called by a lot of different names, seeing things from a particular point of view, verstehen, getting inside the other's worldview, something like that. And objectivity is often associated with causal explanation, knowing what causes what. So often there's a distinction between imaginative understanding and causal explanation. And this first came up, so far as I know, in the social sciences with someone who I always called Dilthey, but I understand is actually called Dilthey. Dilthey? Yeah, is that right? Okay. And Dilthey's point was, when you're doing history, when you're studying history, it's not just a matter of recording objectively what happened in a past period. It's a matter of what you want from history is not just a recording of facts about the past. What you want is to understand what it was like to live in a past time, to understand how the world seemed to people back then. Or in anthropology, there was the great British tradition in anthropology of the anthropologist goes to some far-off land and comes back with a set of stories along the lines of, you'll never believe what this lot get up to, and gives a kind of objective understanding objective description of what the other culture is doing, a description from outside it. And the natural reaction to that was, that's not the kind of account we want of another society. We want to understand how they see the world, how the world seems from their point of view. Or in psychiatry, I know this seems very far from Russell and acquaintance, but we'll get there in a moment. In psychiatry, this distinction is still live today. It was first articulated by Jaspers. The idea was that with a psychiatric patient, you can, one thing you can try and do is the kind of thing that, say, Sachs does in his books on neurology, that you try to sink yourself into the situation of the patient and describe how the world seems from the patient's point of view. And on the other hand, you might say, no, when you say a crazy person, what you mean is, I can't do that. There's no point in trying to get some empathy with this person. All you can do is describe objectively what they're doing. And Jasper said, if you get a patient that is saying things like, there is a king of Spain. He has been found at last. That king is me. I only discovered this today. When you have a delusional patient like that, Jasper said, you can't empathetically understand what the patient is doing. All you can do is describe objectively what the phenomenon is and distance yourself from the other person in that way. Or if you get delusions like, everyone smiles and nods when they see me because I've been sent by God to communicate with people about evil, and I have a letter from the Pope as proof. When you get a really delusional patient like that, you can't get the world from their point of view. There is no such thing as understanding imaginatively what's going on with them. And in recent philosophy, in the last, for most philosophers now, where this contrast comes up most dramatically is with Nagel's classic discussion of what it's like to be a bat. How many people know this discussion of Nagel's? About half, okay. Well, Nagel's point was, if you find yourself shut up in a barn with an excited bat, then you know what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. There's something about bat consciousness that will forever elude you. You can tear a bat apart cell by cell. You could have a complete objective understanding of what's going on with the bat. But because you can't have any imaginative understanding of the world from the bat's point of view, you will always be missing out the facts about its consciousness. I mean, a lot is known scientifically about the way bats' sensory perception works. But Nagel's point was, the subjective character of experience, consciousness itself, is fully comprehensible only from one point of view. So whenever you've got phenomena of consciousness, you can only get at them by imaginative understanding. And that's always going to elude us in the case of the bat. You can have a complete scientific causal description of what's going on with the bat, but that's not going to get you onto the real nature of the phenomenon of consciousness. It'll actually just take you further away from consciousness, because what you really want to get access to the bat's conscious life is an imaginative understanding. Nagel said, at present we're completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying on imagination, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. So whenever you have a phenomenon of consciousness, every subjective phenomenon is essentially connected with a single point of view. So you're not going to be able to get an objective physical theory of consciousness. There's no such thing. So what I want to suggest is that understanding someone's use of language, understanding meaning, understanding how someone else is using their words, is fundamentally an imaginative or empathetic exercise. What you're doing when you're trying to understand someone else's use of language is to see how things are from their point of view. When you're trying to get what someone else is saying, what you're trying to do is get the thing that seems so impossible in the case of a crazy person or in the case of a bat. You want to sink yourself into their point of view, do the imaginative exercise. That's what grasp of meaning is. And a lot of the difficulties that we've been having in this class, the problems that we've been addressing, have to do with the difficulty of translating from an imaginative understanding of someone's use of language to an objective explanation of what's going on. I hope that makes some immediate sense, but I want to go on and give some examples in just a second. So that's the frame. That's the thing that strikes me as a blinding revelation. I'll go on and try and explain why that is in just a second. But are there any questions about the frame? Does that make intuitive? Yep. No, I think that's a difficult case, but I think it itself would be a case of imaginative understanding, understanding how the world seems to you, in the same way that, just using language isn't the same thing as understanding what you're doing in using language. This is the thing that we talked about in connection with Wittgenstein, that just being able to do it isn't enough, that having some insight into what you're doing, and similarly, the other person just being able to, just getting onto how the other person is using language isn't the same thing as having some insight into what they're about. So far as I can see, the two situations are on a par. But all these questions are complex. I mean, that's my first reaction. Yeah. Okay? Okay, so if we go right back to where we began with Frege on sense and reference, then when you're talking about the distinction between uninformative identities and formative identities, the idea was it makes perfect sense to talk about the idea of one take on an object and a different take on an object, right? It takes you a second to understand that, right? It is a very easy idea to get, that there can be different ways of getting onto one and the same object, that these can be two different ways of getting onto a single planet, that these can be two different ways of getting onto a single shed, right? These two different ways, or that there can be different ways of getting onto one and the same person. Now, but then the whole thing about sense is, what we did with sense was we tried to give a descriptivist account of sense, and then we said that doesn't work, and then we moved to thinking of it in terms of acquaintance, and we said, but there you have to really resist the idea that the informative identities are possible. And then we moved on to talking about the causal theory of reference, and then the questions about informative identities kind of slid off the map. And that really recapitulates the way the history of the discussion has gone. Sense has turned out to be a very, very elusive notion. And when you ask, why is that so? That's why sense is so interesting, because it seems so easy to get on the one hand, and then you try and spell out what you're thinking about, what you mean by difference of sense. And it's really difficult. You start out with descriptivism, and then that doesn't work, and then you don't know what else to say. And I think the situation here is that it's very easy to get an imaginative or empathetic understanding of the idea that there are two different ways of thinking of the same object, but it's very, very difficult to give an objective explanation of what that is. And I'm suggesting that we should think of that on a parallel with the way you think about, if only I knew what was going on in the bat head, if only I knew what was going on behind the furry brow, yeah? Or that with someone else, you really can get onto what their conscious life is like, but then you try and give an objective description of what that means, how you scientifically describe someone else's conscious life, and you find you can't do it. And I think this is an instance of the same general phenomenon, that it's very hard to get a translation from an imaginative understanding into an objective explanation. That's what's so intriguing about the notion of sense, yeah? That you immediately grasp it imaginatively. You can really get what it would be for someone to have now one take, now another take on an object, but then you try and spell that out objectively, and it's very, very hard. In fact, we don't know how to do it. Yes? You can't have some objective explanation of consciousness. Yeah. That's right. That's what I'm suggesting. Yeah.
Doesn't it ultimately carry some sort of consequences on the system of general.
It means that there are a lot of puzzles about. Well, I mean,
nature's fundamentally different from one abstractions or
mm-hmm.
nature of this phenomenon is not objective, but subjective.
Right.
Possible.
That is the way the mind-body problem is currently framed, right? I mean, I think Nagel's article is probably the single most influential paper on consciousness ever written. And that's the way it's framed, that you have imaginative understanding of the conscious life, you have objective explanation of what's going on with an organism, and no way of translating between them. Yeah? And I'm suggesting that what's going on with sense is actually an aspect of, you can pan back and see that this is an aspect of that more general problem. Can you put your hand up if that makes intuitive sense? Okay, very good. As I say, it's been striking me as a blinding revelation, and I'm not sure if it's actually, but if that's because it simply rephrases the problem, if you see what I mean. But I think it is putting it in a more general context. Now, what I was suggesting before we broke was that you can actually make some progress with this. Yep. Yeah. are futile.
So, I mean, you can't have an objective but I mean, in the way that you can never do that. You can never
That's right.
imagine what it is to do that.
Okay, I note the word difficult here. I'm not saying impossible, right? When you think about Nagel's way of framing it, it does seem like it's downright impossible, but it can't be impossible. Because on the one hand, all that there is the objective world. Yeah, there isn't any non-objective world. So it must be possible to state all the facts in objective terms. Yeah? It must be crackable. Either that or the problem is wrongly posed. But what I'm suggesting right now is only that it's difficult, that we can't yet see how to do this, but that all the problems we've been thinking about can actually be put in that more general framework. You can actually see this as an instance of this more general thing that comes up in so many areas. Yeah. Okay. Now, what I was suggesting just before we broke was that there's actually a way of interpreting vision science that lets you see how you can make some progress with this. Within imaginative understanding, it's very hard to make sense of causal explanation to find out what causes what. If I just project myself into your mental life, then I might have a good empathetic understanding of you, but not be very sure about what's causing what. But remember, just before we broke, I was saying that in vision science, you can see vision science as actually addressing the question, what causes what in your conscious life, in your visual experience. Do you remember this? This is what we did just before we broke. So I said, you can think of the vision science as telling you about a relation between the subject and the external display, between the subject and the thing they're referring to, the thing they're talking about, the thing on the screen. And that's described, you remember this stuff? So that's described, you can describe that in terms of two different kinds of relation that you stand in to the properties in the scene you're observing. So there's a question about how if your task is, tell me what shape the red symbol is, then here is easy to pull out the red thing because it's very different from the distractors. So the property of redness that you're using to pull out the target is very, differentiates your target from the distractors very well. But here it's harder for it to differentiate the target from the distractors. And reporting the shape of the red thing is easy here, where you only have one symbol shape to report, and harder here, where you have two red symbols shaped to report. So there are two different relations between properties and objects in your visual experience. One is you can use the property to pull out the object, and the other is you can report that property of the object. You remember this kind of thing? And the idea is you can also describe this causal structure at the level of the brain, where you say, here's what the brain processing looks like, or you say, I'm using this property to pull out this object, and then I'm reporting on the properties of the object. So we had this example of using the color of the 5 to pull it out from its background versus reporting the color of the 5. Now, the thing about that is, if you think about this in the context of imaginative versus objective understanding, what you're doing there is this objective understanding or is this imaginative understanding? Well, it must be imaginative, right? Because it's about consciousness. You're describing the structure of someone's conscious experience. So if I'm using this to analyze what your mental life is like right now, as you pull out objects from the background, as you pull out the 5 from the background, I'm describing something about the causal structure of your conscious life. I'm getting at it by means of an experiment. So it must be objective, right? This is science. So what is it? Is it imaginative or is it objective?
You say it's causally reducible. We're not
Is causally what?
reducible. We're not ontological. You can't possibly
I-
describe like the subjective quality of experience like me seeing the fire, but you actually have to put the causal relation between.
I think that's exactly the situation. I wouldn't, I don't know about the ontological and all that, but the second thing you said is, it seems to me right on the button, that on the one hand, it's it's a phenomenon of consciousness, so you only get at it by imaginative understanding. On the other hand, imaginative understanding alone didn't tell you about this causal structure. And that needed some kind of experiment. That needed some kind of getting at by means of objective analysis. That's what you were saying? Yeah? So you can enrich your understanding of, your imaginative understanding of someone's conscious life by objective analysis. But that doesn't mean that you could dispense with the imaginative understanding altogether. All right? So that's a little bit tricky. Let me frame that question again. I said you can be using the colour to pull out the 5 from his background, and it's a different phenomenon from being able to report the colour of the 5. Objective or imaginative? Hands up if you think it's imaginative. If you think it's objective? Wow, okay. Well, you know, the vision scientists would be extremely annoyed at the idea that it's not objective, right? But what I'm saying is this really should be analysed as, this really should be understood as analysing a phenomenon of consciousness. So you put it in the frame of imaginative understanding. Yep.
So sorry, what you say is both the imagination and the
That's right.
So the first bit, putting the colour out, is imaginative, and reporting on it is objective.
Understanding that what you've got here is a phenomenon of consciousness at all is imaginative. Yeah, that's the thing that can't be, you can't do away with. That to understand that someone's really seeing the 5, not just responding to it the way a zombie or a robot might, but actually has conscious experience of the 5. That part's imaginative. Getting that causal structure, the relation between the property and the object, that's a matter of analysis. That's a matter of objective understanding. Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. That's really what you said originally. Okay, so if you put it like that, then that gives you a way of stating the notion of sense, of stating the relation that has to hold between your experience of a property and your experience of an object, for your experience of the property to be constituting the way you're being given the object. If that property of the object is how you're pulling out the object from its background, well, that's your way of being given the object. That's what's is more complex than the 5 in this case, but because they're more complex properties. But the properties that you're using to pull out the shed from its background in this case are different to the properties that you're using to pull out the shed from its background in that case. Yeah, but that really needs some analysis for it to make sense, right? It's not the first thing that would occur to you if you're trying to articulate what seems so easy about the distinction between this take and the object and that take. But what I'm suggesting is that you can use that kind of supplementation of imaginative understanding to articulate the notion of sense. Yeah? So who says there isn't progress in philosophy? That solves it, right? That's when an identity is informative. When you're pulling out the object by means of different properties in 2 cases, and it's uninformative when you're pulling out the object by means of the same properties in the 2 cases. So you can't solve these problems. Right?
What about properties that aren't properties of the object, per se?
Properties that aren't properties of the object per se.
Well, I mean, things that descriptions I might just pick out, something in the world that other people might not see, let's say, like a cafe I went to Tuesday.
The cafe I went to on Tuesday. That's a property of the cafe. Yes. I mean, it's true or false depending on how things are with that cafe. Yeah, but there's another point here. There's a deeper point here that you're making, which is this really only works for simple, basic cases of perception, right? But what you're describing is not a perceptual property of the cafe. That's not how you pull the cafe out, yeah? Unless you're describing it, that's a description, right? That's how you access the cafe. But you didn't need to articulate a description of the shed in terms of these properties that you visually use to pull it out. Do you see what I mean? When you say, the cafe I went to on Tuesday, that picks out an object by a description that you've got of it. When you're just pulling out the 5 from its background, or the shed from its background, you don't need to articulate that kind of descriptive identification of the thing. Yeah? This brings us on finally to Russell. So if you've been looking at Russell and acquaintance, Russell makes a lot of striking remarks about acquaintance. The faculty of being acquainted with things other than itself is the main characteristic of a mind. That's what a mind is. And acquaintance with objects essentially consists in the relation between the mind and something other than the mind. It is this that constitutes the mind's power of knowing things. So a mind is essentially something relational. And that relation is a relation of consciousness. That relation of acquaintance that grounds all our thinking is a relation of consciousness. Simpler than any knowledge of truths, independent of any knowledge of truths, and every proposition we can understand must be composed entirely of constituents with which we're acquainted. So understanding is always grounded in this relation of consciousness between the mind and the environment. So as in that case of the cafe, we're acquainted with universals like yellow. That's what grounds our understanding of any description, like the cafe I went to last Tuesday. To say that I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object, when I'm directly aware of the object itself. So we're talking here about the kind of phenomenon that isn't available in the case of the bat, if you see what I mean. You're talking about an understanding of someone's conscious experience of the world when you're trying to understand the meaning they give to their signs. You're thinking about how they're consciously related to their surroundings. The word acquaintance is designed to emphasize the relational character of the fact with which we're concerned. So suppose Nagel is right, suppose that thing I began with from Nagel is right about not being possible to get at conscious experience except by way of imaginative understanding. Then what Russell's saying about acquaintance means that any understanding you have of language must be at bottom an imaginative understanding. Right, that just follows. If you buy what Nagel said about the bat, what's missing here is understanding of consciousness. Because we're missing any kind of imaginative understanding, then if all grasp of propositions is grounded in your acquaintance with your surroundings, and acquaintance is a relation of consciousness, then to understand someone else's use of language, you must be exercising imaginative understanding. That's what the thing is. And then you can see that the general problem here is that it's difficult to give an objective explanation of linguistic meaning in general, because it's difficult to give an objective explanation of consciousness of your environment. That's why all the problems we've been discussing are so hard. That's why, for example, naturalism is so difficult, because the whole naturalist project is trying to ground an understanding of meaning in terms of objective causal relations between the subject and the environment. It's just an instance of that more general problem. So the general issue is that imaginative understanding can't readily be translated into objective explanation. Yes? Yeah, that's right.
It seems to be an active
What, an active?
It's an activity. The connotational
Yeah.
characterizing finding is actually identifying, picking out that
Yeah.
reference object, but its connection to the world is where Franklin describes immediate present experience, and we became Franklin's argument in present immediate experience. I think it's exactly the same. It's an activity that's pulling out.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can certainly think of attention here, namely, if you just look round the room, pulling out now one thing, then another, yeah, then that is certainly an activity. Yeah? But it's described in terms of this use of properties to single out objects that is not itself something that's, how should I put it, it's not necessarily under conscious control. When you're, I mean, which properties you use to pick out the object. I just suddenly see this hat. So if you're using the colour to pull out the hat from the background, right, that's what's making it salient. You didn't necessarily give yourself a conscious instruction, use the blackness to pull the hat out from its background. That just happened, your visual system did that. What I'm suggesting is that I think there's something right about the traditional idea that an imaginative understanding doesn't tell you about causation. Yeah? But this thing about property and object in experience is a causal question. Which properties of the object are causally allowing you to pull it out from its background? Yeah? And I'm suggesting that causal question, which comes within imaginative understanding, can be probed objectively. Yeah, that's kind of paradoxical, but that seems to be the situation. And in that bombshell, we're over time. So okay, we'll talk a bit more about acquaintance and a bit more about Wittgenstein on Wednesday.